right. Well, first I wanted to thank you, Leon, for being able to make it to this interview. It's a great honor to have you here. I think some students are going to join and sooner, and also the interview we're doing today will be published on YouTube and Instagram for people to be able to review it. I wanted to start this interview actually before jumping into my first question. I wanted to know if you saw actually Stephen Hall's statement to condemn President Trump's executive order to promote the classical architecture. Hall stated, and I quote, Stalin, Hitler, and now Trump all tried to block modernist architecture. I wanted to hear your response on this comparison by Hall, who did a lot of noise and I think illustrate a lot of what most modern and postmodern architecture feel by having the Trump administration back the classical architecture.
Well, I mean, I have written about this, and that is the reason why there was this association, manipulated association of, or very loaded association of traditional architecture, classicism, and dictatorial powers, is that reason. For that reason, I published a book about Albert Speer. You know, when I started to be interested in or do architecture, which was not completely, because I started with modernism and Corbusier and so on. But when I started to be even using the slightest reference to classical planning or classical architecture, starting at the university, that's why I left the university, because I couldn't work. People said, the professor said, this is like the Third Reich. I said, but Third Reich, they did rockets, they did all sorts of things which we continue. You build motorways. What's the problem with classical architecture? And which they couldn't answer. And so I got more and more into it. And then I started to really see that there was system. And that modernism is actually a strange phenomenon, which is not very well explained. Why something, traditional building and classical architecture, which in all cultures and throughout all ages worked very well and produced marvels and places to worship and places to feel at home around the world, despite the political systems, whether the political systems were murderous or more humanitarian or Christian or Muslim or whatever religion or Eastern religions, classical architecture and traditional building was the way to build shelters, to build places of convention where you meet, to build places of worship where you honor whatever you believe in. And totalitarian systems, modern industrial totalitarian systems inherited. They inherited language, whether it's Russian or German or English, and they inherited cultural means and technology, which were related to building, organizing the territory, and so on. And so it is absolutely incredible psychologically. Why not more psychoanalysts and psychologists occupy themselves with this phenomenon that after Stalin or after Hitler, uniquely architecture was seen as guilty, as being cahoots with totalitarian system. Whereas anyone who studies Stalinist architecture or Nazi architecture or Italian architecture, who has any sense, any feeling of aesthetics or appreciation of proportion or construction, sees that these are the last periods where building was well done in all regimes. So what is the cause? What is the cause? Because if what totalitarian systems used in far as language, in far as technologies for building rockets or building cars or building machinery, if there was really a link, a direct, inevitable and guilty link between these kind of technologies and means of production, why were they not forbidden after the systems collapsed? When you debate this, people accuse you of being anti-Semite, because when you look at the book, the Speer book, which, by the way, I don't know how much it costs now, but when it's down to $70, it means that it has been reprinted. Otherwise, it shoots up to 3,000 or 2,000, whatever. And the people who attack the book actually have not read it, because it makes really distinction between what is really to do with repression and what is to do with representation of power. And all powers use means of representation. If they don't, they will fail. And one of the, that's why I tried to demonstrate now for years, why Europe is so little, Europe as a political entity is so little respected by the people, by the voters, by those who adults, is because when you look at every single building built by the European community in the last 60 years, in my lifetime, is ugly, is shoddy, doesn't make sense neither as architecture, aesthetics, or even as urban contribution to an urban mean, doesn't really create meaning neither in Brussels, nor in Strasbourg, nor in Luxembourg. It's just buildings, which are now often being renovated or even demolished and so on. And so it is very important that we rethink this relation of power to architecture, because any power which is organized, communal, and which has a wider than individual meaning, I think has in the end to come to this conclusion that you have to build well, you have to be pleasing in a way which pleases everybody, and not just the power holders, but even the people who are under that rule, or whether it's democratic or totalitarian. And so I even say now, I refuse to work, to travel to countries like Spain when it was under Franco, or to Chile when it was under Pinochet and or communism. But I say now, even if you have clients and they are evil people, if they let you build, if they let you design what you think is right, do it, because something these evil people will leave behind, which is going to serve better mankind. Because, this attitude, ideologically defined attitude that you must not do certain things because you don't ideologically agree with, and have nothing which you do which would transcend now the moral stance or the moral quality of the people, of your clients, we wouldn't have anything, because you can accuse almost every decent building in the past to have been built by a regime which was somehow you don't agree with. But the extraordinary thing is that I, as a Catholic, or grew up as a Catholic, I can admire Islamic architecture, whether it's in Iran or wherever it is, or Japanese imperial temple, in Ise. When I see that, I'm struck by its beauty, and I admire the quality of the building. I love these buildings. So why shouldn't I love building? If Hitler or Stalin, the worst dictator of the 20th century, did some good building, that does not mean that I am guilty because they did something good. No. And now to accuse people, this now everyone you don't agree with is supposed to be like Hitler. I remember when under President Trump, there was an edict in his last week of, I think in 2020, he published an edict that public federal buildings of more than $50 million should preferentially be built in classical style. This was based on a Harris poll, which which found out, do you know about this Harris poll?
Yeah, I've heard
Which
about
was
it.
done by the Civic Arts Society of Washington and Justin Schubo, revealed that in 2020, and this was published during the Black Lives Matter phenomenon, 73% of Republicans prefer classical building to modernist. 73% of independent prefer classical to modernist, and 70% of Democrats prefer classical to modernist. So there was a time when the United States was torn apart by controversy and disagreements about many things. Architecture seems to be, classical architecture seems to be in majority in a subject where most Americans from whatever race, color, language, or roots seem to agree. And spontaneously, when you feel about it, you know it's true. Because when you see a nice building, you like it. Whatever. I remember when I was very much on the left when I was young, not very much, but I was leaning more as a good Catholic, starting then to have sympathies for communism and so on. Didn't last very long, but anyway, I felt more on the left politically. And when I first saw the palace of Palazzo della Civiltà in Rome, I felt embarrassed because I thought this is the most beautiful building I've ever seen. And I didn't dare take a picture of it. I took a picture in hiding behind the car. And because it was built under Mussolini, it is a very stripped down building, but an extraordinary idea, which is unique. It's called Colosseo Quadrato because it has the same number of arches than the Colosseum in Rome, 216, I think, but it's a block rather than an oval. And so it's very important to understand that your moral and aesthetic judgment, there are two things, and evil people can do very good rockets or beautiful buildings. And that the message really of the Speer book was the question, can a great criminal, a war criminal, can he be a great artist? And of course, it's self-evident. Because if otherwise we apply our moral standards to past architecture, we condemn everything. Because most past powers are often very violent, are racist, are, I don't know what. I mean, just like we are now. Look around.
No, I mean, you spoke a lot about this, but I mean, Le Corbusier too had his, his a past that's not completely,
Corbusier is just a book by himself. Huh?
Exactly. I mean, I know you did an entire interview on it, so maybe I don't want to, come back to it and dive deep into it. But I think what I found interesting in your Speer book is that I think everyone speaks about the part where perhaps you try to highlight, the key things that made his architecture interesting. But I think a lot less, because I don't think that many people read the book and just, read the title and say, Krier, I idealized Speer. When I've read the whole book, I've actually realized that in many instances, you even critique him on an architectural scale, by saying that on the long term, you think that he perhaps would have abandoned his architectural, I would say, articulations and then go more towards socialization because it was just the course on how things would have even gone. And I think if I remember well, and please let me know if I'm wrong, but I think Speer's dad was also an architect at some point.
Yeah.
And I still remember at some point reading that even towards the end, his dad kind of said, well, I think he went too far into things. And at some point I think he he made a mistake. He did not perhaps pursue what he initially wanted to do. Sort
Well,
of.
I actually did the book for several reasons. One of the reasons was that before I published the big book with Maurice Culot, there had been a book published by Siedler in Germany, virtually same format, with a lot of the same images, but with texts which were, I thought, ridiculous, and particularly with the introduction of Speer accusing himself, which I know was not honest, because I told him so. I didn't believe. You know you are a good architect. I mean, when you are a good architect, you know you are the first one to know it. I mean, you are an architect, huh? So you know what. When you are a pianist, you know when you are good. I'm a pianist. I know I'm not. I mean, I have to work. When I work, I can play decently, and I love it. Huh? But I'm not a good pianist. So when you are a good architect, you know it. And he knew that he was a good architect. He had enormous talent, absolutely unbelievable. When I study his teacher, Tessenov, was not a classical architect. He was a traditional architect, but he was more a greater thinker. Tessenov was more a philosopher than a great architect. He was a fantastic draftsman. He did beautiful line drawings, which are poetic and very suggestive. But Speer, when he came to become influential, had virtually no urban discipline. He had not been taught what he was asked to do by Hitler. And within like month, he became a master of his own trade, which is shows an extraordinary inborn talent and learning capacity. And actually, one of the mistakes, there's only one thing I would correct in the book, is a project which says somewhere, I think it's in the introduction, in the English introduction, is a project by Rudolf Weiss, who was a student of Otto Wagner. And the date says 1943, which looks like Speer's project in Nuremberg, the Zeppelinfeld. You know. And no, that project is from 1913. And when the book was republished in America, they refused to correct it because they would have had to change the films, because there was a direct link between Hitler's interest in classicism was very much related to the Ringstrasse, what was built in around Vienna once the walls, the historic defense walls came down, and they built the ring with the opera house, and it's famous, the ring around central Vienna. And they were the epitome of really capable, whether it's the Gothic church or classical buildings. Theophil Hansen, famous architects, built the Parliament building and the opera and so on. And Otto Wagner, who was the greatest architect, I think, of the turn of century, he built, under Hansen, he built actually one of the palaces on the Ringstrasse. And these were the buildings which immediately Hitler talks in his youth about, has been researched and is documented, that he was fascinated by this Ringstrasse. And I assume also by the school of Otto Wagner, who was brilliant people. I can send you, I finally found a book on PDF, which costs otherwise, it's unpayable, but incredibly powerful projects done between 1900 and 1914, which were the direct source for actually Italian futurist architecture, French Art Deco architecture, and German Nazi architecture. And some of it was, Speer's work was stripped down classicism and then became later more and more decorative. But also you must think that if you increase scale, if you just enlarge building masses, they have to be articulate with, your elements must be articulate with more than just joints. Otherwise they become primitive or or brutal. And articulation has to do, classical architecture, articulation in classical building has very much to do with how you actually define, how you relate to the joints, the different parts, the elements, how they join, and how you conceal or beautify or articulate the joints between vertical and horizontal, between the different parts which make up a classical construct. And so if you deal with very large masses, you need other elements than when you do stables. And I think that Speer in that was actually a master. You have the same in Russia, where you had incredibly talented architects who built under Stalin. The problem is often the scale of the urban, the urban plan is like bloated. Spaces are beyond human scale, but the buildings themselves are incredibly interesting. If you forget about the Gulag and if you can't forget about the cruelty of the system. But these are great architecture, and it's often the context which is a bit too beyond human scale. But so you have to see what is the quality, and if you are as a young architect, you want to see what you are able to do or want to do, you have to use all these means wherever they come from. Because I grew up in a fantastically beautiful town in Luxembourg, and there had been no war damage. There were architecture the town was 1,000 years old, so there was great architecture of very different periods, which had to do also that was a fortress and was a small capital. And so there are all these things you learn by, I was not taught in school, and I finally worked for a great English architect, James Sterling, but he had no clue about classical architecture. When I got interested, and he himself got interested in it, but there was no way you can jump in, you can do something which you don't know. You cannot speak a language unless you know the meanings and you have practiced it somewhat. So I virtually self-educated myself by measuring, by drawing, by learning buildings by heart, and then redrawing them from memory. See what the proportions that produces, purely memory. But that is one way of learning, and because our schools don't teach this sort of thing, exactly, there's only one school in the United States which systematically teaches classical architecture and urbanism, is Notre Dame. You had the program in Miami, but it's now gone very loose, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there was always, I think, Liz.
Frank Martinez, or these people.
Yeah. I mean, she worked a lot to be able to keep it, but of course, I don't think that it is the same as it was when she was dean. It changed a lot.
Liz Plater-Zyberg, yeah.
Liz Plater-Zyberg, yes. When she was dean, I think it was very promoted, and it was very, I mean, perhaps not to the scale of Notre Dame, but it was, I think it was very promoted. I think when the deanship changed, then it became much more
permissive. But because there were some teachers who are practicing this kind of discipline, so they were good teachers. And but it's very important that you know that it is possible, that it's not a forbidden fruit, as other schools, and not only forbidden fruit, but you get thrown out if you get more interested. And so it's important to talk about this, because that's why I understood immediately what was happening with COVID and with Gaza, and that suddenly there's a Belgian psychoanalyst from the mass formation, that suddenly people agree en masse about something they intimately should know, that they are just, it's propaganda, And particularly when you hear voices who are articulate and intelligent, who tell you why it is propaganda. And it's astonishing how little how little architects resisted this ideology, while the reality of modernism is such a poor product around the world compared to what we call mistakenly historical architecture. What we should say is traditional architecture. Everything is historic. I mean, even language is historic, but it's not for that reason that we can't speak a language. So, but this, I think this ideology is now collapsing because there are now many experiences. Things are now, I'm now nearly 80 years old. My brother died when he was 85, 84. So things have been built. I remember when I worked for Sterling, I was asked to teach at the EA, and somebody showed me something of Quinlan Terry. You probably heard of Quinlan Terry. So I said, wow, this is really interesting. Who is this guy? And then I asked around everyone, who is Quinlan Terry? And people would say, but he's a Christian. So I said, what does that have to do with architecture? I mean, this is interesting. How does he dare to? Yeah, but he's a reactionary Christian. I said, I don't care. I mean, I'm a reactionary, I don't know what, or revolution. What does it have to do with architecture? So, of course, people didn't talk about that. And that was a way to get rid of some people who were really doing an alternative and who were able to build, because Quinlan Terry, by that time, his master was Raymond Erith, very interesting architect. And Raymond Erith was virtually the only classicist who, after the war, continued practicing great classical architecture in England. And actually, when you see every 2 days on the news, number 10 Downing Street, 10 Downing Street, you know what that is. Huh? And that's a building by Raymond Erith, 1954. And if he had been a modernist, he would have building by Lassen in concrete with big numbers and I don't know what, So, but this was a unique figure, extraordinary talent, interesting architect when you study his work. But he was slandered as a reactionary and, So it's very important, the freedom of speech. And it's the most important thing, because otherwise democracy, what does it mean? No, we don't know. It's a mysterious power system, and it's certainly not what it's supposed to be. But freedom of speech is a fundamental and absolute, which must be imposed by tolerance, and freedom of speech must be imposed by police force. If you're intolerant, you should be arrested. You should tolerate people you completely disagree with or go to prison. But not for what you say. You should go to prison. And unless you commit horrible crimes. And therefore we are now at the point where the political discourse is so completely losing all logic or common sense that the vilest genocide is happening now for 3 years, and we are not supposed to talk about it. Whenever I am in a public meeting, I mention it, and people, they get very nervous. But I mean, how lucky we are not to be in this situation and be able to talk about it without being arrested. In Germany, you lose your bank account if you live in Germany and talk about this. So, because this tolerance is what is the most important thing in whatever regime you live. So tolerance is the most important. And now we discover that actually, if we are in democracy is supposed to be tolerant of people you disagree with. And certainly in religion, in whatever, and certainly in architecture. And freedom of choice is the other very important column of democracy. That you should be free to choose the car which you want, or the wife, or the religion you want. Shouldn't be imposed by the state. And why not architecture? Because now when we build, not only the Harris Poll, but also, I was involved in two big urban projects, which never had, even in difficult times, 2008, no problem, were economically extremely successful. I was also involved very much on the sides, not directly physically, but with the reconstructions in Germany, in Dresden and in Frankfurt, and even in Berlin for the castle. Indirectly, I was one of the two who actually promoted 1991, and it's now even in print. And those buildings, the reconstructions in Germany, historic reconstructions in Germany, were all built against the architects, against the common agreement of the architectural establishment, against administrations, because of civic enterprise. And they are unbelievably popular and actually beautiful. You get to see them. It was 2 weeks ago, I was near Paris in the keynote speaker for a mayor's conference where there were over 30 mayors of French towns and suburbs. Some of them have already rebuilt the modernist suburbs, destroyed modernist buildings, and rebuilt classical suburbs to enormous success. And the mayor in Plessis-Robinson, who built this extension with the office of Breitmans and François Speer, that he said, if you build, he has been voted, I think, 10 or 11 times back in the last 30, I think, nearly 40 years, he built this project. And from building from a modernist slum to an attractive middle-class town. He said, if you choose this kind of architecture, you will be re-voted for mayors who were there. And around Paris and south of France, there are everywhere projects now who do this, and contradicting all the prejudice against it when I grew up. It's too expensive, you can't do it, it's philosophically wrong, economically unachievable, the crafts don't exist. It's all lies. Because if you know how to draw a traditional building, whether it's classical or vernacular, you always find the craftsmen to build them. Sometimes in Qatar, when you work in Qatar, or like El Wakil, he did a lot in Saudi, you have to bring them from Lebanon, from Turkey, from Morocco, or even from Pakistan, because these projects, there are crafts surviving. And even now in Germany, because of these reconstruction projects, you have again a thriving craft industry of traditional building crafts. And so it's very important. I don't tell you that you should do it, you must do it, but it's a choice. And when somebody says you don't have choice, you have to follow modernism or you are out, you are beside the stream of history, it's just, they are ideologues. And they are certainly unhappy people because in the chain of production of traditional architecture and urbanism, virtually everyone involved in building, living, or selling or has pleasure. I'm now nearly 80. I still every day draw. I have enormous pleasure. I'm a very, very happy person. Most of my modernist friends at my age, they're all frustrated. They don't know where they are going. They know that modernism has no future. Whereas we now have in Notre Dame and in Madrid, we have a foundation which publishes every year a yearbook, like 500 pages, with traditional projects from around the world, which are fantastic, from India, from Thailand, from China, from Russia, from United States, from everywhere. I mean, this is a thriving thing, and more young people discover this, that is a choice. In New York, the offices like Bob Stern have always a large part to do traditional and classical architecture. America has been more tolerant because Bob was also dean at Yale. So Dimitri Porphyrios and I, and George Knight, we were the small classical cell amongst in the modernist environment, but still it was possible without being thrown out. And I think United States is a better environment for this because it's traditionally more tolerant. But it's tough. You know that there's a lot of arguing, but it's important to talk about, I think, to have public discourse about it.
I wanted to ask you because I think we've heard you a lot throughout the years really try, critique modernism and also talk about it, in many other ways, things that, for instance, Le Corbusier did that you think were very successful. I also heard you talk about the Barcelona building by Mies, saying that you were very impressed by the building. But I think where people hear you less perhaps is on what came after, on post-modern architecture. And I think, which is, I think today defined by a singular, is not really defined by a singular movement, but perhaps on what modernism was, but more in terms of, social and ecological themes. And these themes, I think, now often dictates whether this architect receives a Pritzker Prize or not. And so, given that, I think I kind of wanted to ask you, where do you see the architectural profession today? And do you think we have lost a coherent architectural language? And is this fragmentation and natural evolution of the field, in your opinion?
Well, I don't know whether you have one of the books to read. Is you probably read it, but is Jim Kunstler's The Long Emergency on our dependence on fossil fuel. I mean, this was published more than 20 years ago, and it's a very powerful book because it shows you how much we depend on fossil fuel, and it's an absolute evidence that without fossil fuel, coal and petrol, there wouldn't be any synthetic materials. Synthetic building materials have completely changed building materials around the world. Somebody said, that's good. People used to sing all the time. Now it's not just for children. But, the traditional materials, whether it's stone or wood, teach people who have talent what to do with them. Whether you build a bow, an armament, a weapon, or whether you build a house, a shelter. And whereas concrete, Lou Kahn said, the brick tells you how to do an arch. It teaches you how to do an arch, because if you don't do it correctly, it will collapse. Whereas synthetic materials, whether it's plastics or steel or concrete, they are liquid materials which are cast into certain forms. And they, by solidifying, they become, they have a certain independence of gravity. Gravity, whether you put an aeroplane upside down, doesn't really, you hold it somehow, doesn't change its shape. Whereas when you take an arch, put it upside down. So gravity was a very important way to define how you build in stone or brick or even in wood. Carpentry is defined also, but it's largely independent of gravity, because you can take a timbered building and put it upside down and it will still stand. So it's very important to understand this, that the traditional materials teach you the traditional crafts and disciplines are really a result of making things at human scale and for human use with the minimum of effort and the maximum of efficiency and beauty. And this holds true for all vernacular classical architecture around the world, because because without usefulness or without beauty, they have no life in them and they get destroyed. So what does that tell us about the future? As there's everything in nature is beautiful. Everything. Whether you look at the macro scale, our human scale, or the micro scale, you look into a microscope, you see beauty. Whether it's even a disease looks beautiful under the microscope. You see an order, you see music, you see movement, you see ballet of cells. So ugliness of an environment is a purely cultural project, a product of a technology which is not yet mastered by the eye and by the aesthetic sense. Because even animals have aesthetic sense. If you see how animals move, I mean, it's a ballet, you know, it's like tango. When the cat chases a mouse, it's unbelievably beautiful. And so we don't know what to do with concrete and steel. Steel is so, and metals are so expensive that the way they are cast are often, you know, the beams, they are quite nice as beams, but that's not yet architecture. Or engines, motors, cast in steel, they're incredibly beautiful. And Corbusier's book, Vers une Architecture, now it's full of machines and aeroplanes and showing the beauty, that the sense of beauty in producing industrial objects was held. And actually,
by the way, I'm sorry, I'm gonna cut you off for 1 second, but it made me think a lot about, you know, the airplanes that you also do and draw in your own drawings. And I always wondered if this was, you know, your early, it came from your early inspirations from Corbusier, who used to, you know, put a lot of airplanes.
No, I was fascinated by airplanes before I read Corbusier. I came because of and my brother said, rather than building models, you should be interested in architecture, because he was 8 years older. It's the other way around. But no, because it's a fact. If you look at, you know, at modern weaponry or modern airplanes, rockets, you strip down the ugly paint they put on them. Huh? They are objects of unbelievable, breathtaking beauty. And so the engineers who did, because nature works, elegance is always, an efficient object is almost always elegant, because otherwise it's not aerodynamic, it doesn't do, I don't know, it doesn't wash well or things like that. But architecture, you know, casting concrete, you know, people are helpless. And then people criticize, you know, modernists, you know, you can't make arches because arches is historic. It's an idiotic thing which should be banned. I mean, people should go red when they say such a thing, because even an arch, you know, concrete cast in an arch is more solid than concrete cast in a flat lintel. They break after a while because something, humidity or the stress caused by cars or by window creates a problem with the steel which is inside. So it will take time. I think if we are going to live with concrete, it will take another several generations before we begin to do really nice, acceptable concrete buildings, because whatever was built in concrete, except the Atlantic Wall, military, you know, the Atlantic Wall built by the Nazis from Basque Country to Norway, they're unbelievably breathtakingly beautiful, beautiful structures, which were actually the main influence on Corbusier's post-war, béton brut, you know, the concrete, raw concrete. And it was built under Speer. Speer became the head of the Organisation Tot, which was responsible for building the bunkers. And actually, Hitler was directly involved in the design of those bunkers, because there's a lot of sketches where he corrected the very important influence on modernism post-war. But one has to look at these things. What happened actually, instead of with some ideological blind that this you can and this you are not allowed to do. And so the aesthetic sense is not dead, because even though I think the modern world, if you had imagined 50 years ago what the world would be like in 2025, you look at the projections done when I was a child, modernism was very elegant and, beautiful world of smooth, elegant objects and people. And now when you see at the vulgarity, when you travel around the world, I mean, the absolute shocking vulgarity of shopping malls in most towns, suburbs, I mean, was unimaginable that this would happen. But despite that, and the music you hear everywhere, disgusting, like machinery, it's nothing to do with music. So there's complete decadence in the visual and the musical culture. But when you build something beautiful, basically new traditional, people stop and take a photograph. And it's so fantastic. After the buildings around the dome were finished, I was involved to create that initially in Frankfurt. The architects were very much against it, but then all the major news programs in Germany, television and so on, they did videos documenting people coming to look at these buildings. And you had people not just wearing ties, but also tattooed people and wearing blue jeans and also the punk. Everybody goes to see these buildings, and people, the video casters, they would then ask people, what do you think? And even these people, you think, I mean, they really look like they're punk culture. No, they love these buildings. And they say, why didn't they do all the buildings like that? Because half of the buildings are also modernist. No. Why didn't they do the whole thing like that? So there's a sense, it's interesting, that a sense in architecture, for good architecture, survives even in a general visual culture, which I wouldn't say is very happy yet. And so now my hope was that with the end of the fossil civilization, driven by fossil fuels, there would be necessarily a return to traditional crafts and traditional means of locomotion. And but now I hear that finally, after 60 years of research, that it seems that the fusion reactors in France and in China, they are being able to produce a means of creating energy which would be virtually without limit. And I think that would be terrible condemnation for mankind, because it's this kind of cheap energy where we don't rely on our human, neither intelligence nor physical muscular structure, that allows us to do the most nonsensical, out of human scale things, which I think is really dooms is not for a good future. I think the most important thing is for an individual today is to see how he can live and have happy work, despite the system going the wrong direction massively. I have personally achieved that because I never had bad work, and mostly I feel responsible for what I do because it gives me also pleasure, and gives pleasure to the people who build them and use them and so on.
I think this conversation is really interesting. I kind of wanted to jump into the sort of part two that I really wanted to speak with you about, which is about architectural education. You've had an interview you did with Andres Duani, where you you and him mainly speak about, trying to reform architecture school to basically try to reduce a little bit of its theory and rather introduce more practical means, and then also introduce others skills or courses that architects could actually take on entrepreneurship, marketing, business. So when they have, when they're out of school, they basically have a lot of, skills on how to open their own firm and how to start. And I really wanted to expand on that because, since then I have not heard, people speak about that. And I think today architecture and our architectural profession is in deep crisis, because of all these things, because, we've kind of kept the same education through all of those years. Perhaps before we had less theory, but I mean, at least I would say until the 80s, we've had the same package, and we see other fields like engineering and like, every 1 to 2 years, the whole thing completely changes because there are new advances in the profession. But with architecture, somehow feel like we're still stuck in the Stone Age. I wanted to hear your opinion on that. Perhaps we can elaborate more on.
Well, architectural education is also related to general education, which we are subjected to since childhood, and which is modern education. I mean, starting really basically with industrial society, is a system which disregards individual talent, because it subjects every single individual to kind of uniform what is to do with language or mathematics or science, or general culture. And that is a deadly formula, because after 200 years of this system, we know that there is complete degradation of general knowledge. And that is not so bad, but that people do not, during their school time, they do not learn what they are good at. So you are basically, it's humiliating. We had, and because not only the students, but because the teachers are bored to tears to teach. I studied Latin for 8 years, and I did not have a single teacher in Latin who loved the language. We never spoke about poetry or recited poetry. It was all grammar and vocabulary. And so humiliation, you had to stand there and then recite by heart, follow, respond question and answers, and then be humiliated. And whereas a language, Latin, in the last year, I was so fed up, I loved poetry. So I recited every morning for 10 minutes classical poetry, shouting loud, to have a kind of fluency like you need for a language. And after 3 months, you speak Latin. It's supposed to be a dead language. And so it's a system, not only of the poor victims who go through for 15 years, who's obligatory sitting in benches and getting bored. With the most exciting subjects, you get bored in school because you feel that the teachers are bored having to repeat 30 every year the same thing. It's absolutely deadly. Whereas we know that, for instance, where there's still good teaching in music, when you only learn when you have real talent. You need a real good teacher who loves you, who loves your talent and helps you to bring out the best in you rather than humiliating you. And so it's very important that, and that children are born with an inborn curiosity. They want to know, they explore, they touch, they want to know. They ask thousands of questions, driving adults crazy. And that is, the traditional society needs that everyone's talent needs to be respected and used in the most efficient way for the society, but also to the best satisfaction of the individual. Otherwise, he would not be good at it. And so we are now in society where most of the jobs are basically can be done tomorrow or already done by robots. They are going to be going out of the world. Most work done by architects now in offices is horrible bore, having nothing to do with architecture, administering codes, drawing cables, where they, I mean, in the past, the most beautiful buildings were done basically by 3-4 drawings, and the rest was done by a body of craftsmen who know as much individually as the architects know. The architect is supposed to be the generalist, who knows about the overall form and the overall vocabulary. But each craftsman is incredible, is a dictionary of a lexicon of names and forms, and the skill to how to do certain forms. So that needs to be there in order to be an efficient architect. The best buildings in the past were done by very few drawings, but those drawings were just an indicator to a whole chain of production of skills who knew what to do with them. Now you have to draw. Apparently, the architect is responsible for 10 years or for everything. Whatever cable is under the plaster needs to be done according to a certain code at a certain height. Otherwise, you can get arrested in Spain or in Luxembourg or in Germany. And so it has very little to do with what you are as an architect, why you wanted to do architecture, which is really to do a job which you like and to do objects of beauty. And that is where I think architectural education has to be completely, and you cannot change globally, but you have to start with single schools or single cells where you teach these. In Germany, there was something called the Akademie des Handwerks near Münster in Schloss Reisfeld, who for 10 years had educated more than 1,000 masters in the different crafts of building. Unfortunately, it has been taken over by commercial interest. But the same in France, when the Notre Dame, the roof burned, was rebuilt by several thousand craftsmen, which are formed in France by les Compagnons du Devoir. It's a system of apprenticeship and mastering, teaching different young people in different crafts, and they were able to do it, just like as good as original. And so you need to. We have now a big project in the Gulf state to create a new town, where in the first phase we'll have very large a craft school teaching all the crafts of building trades, and which will be part of the construction. It was basically imagined by El Wakil, you probably heard of Abdelwahed El Wakil, or in Lebanon, this Mohammed Mahamoue, who is also very good. There are people everywhere, and so these people are now around the world forming networks to recreate this skill, and of course attract again the talents of young people and to get them in the line of what they are good at to become masters. And I think, but this is not a big social project. It's really a project to form a new elite, because it goes against the system. In France, there was one, Luc Ferry. He's a philosopher, but he was Minister of Education in the 90s. And he said, that he would, within his ministry, he would again recreate a system of vocational training, rather than people getting bored in benches, sitting in benches without learning anything, getting distracted by their telephones, that they would again teach according to the individual vocations. He lasted 6 months because it went so much against the grain of the teaching bureaucracy, who are not interested in teaching. They are bored, and They just want to think of their pension, getting out of the horrible drag of practicing. Whereas, a good pianist does not retire because he's 65 years old, because he has so much pleasure playing the instrument that he will die, playing. And that's with all the traditional crafts. That's like that. Only Hannah Arendt writes beautifully about this, making the difference between body work and handwork. Body work is slavery, is tough, and very few people are gifted for that. The athletes who really love this kind of thing. But handwork is really something which engages the brain and is a machine for pleasure, daily pleasure, and you earn your living by having every day loving to do what you do. And because you work with a society of people, a group of people, of craftsmen or people who appreciate what you are good at, you appreciate what they are good at, and you do beautiful things, and everyone enjoys life. And so it's a chain which is irresistible once you discover it. Because we are creatures of God, whoever that is, but everyone has an unreplaceable talent. And if you don't practice it, it gets lost. You have to, thanks God, I had parents who were musician and craftsmen and so on. My mother was a great pianist, but I felt I'm not going to be a pianist. I wanted to be a pianist, but they were always encouraging us in what we were doing. And my brother said, "You are a genius." And you need this encouragement from youth to really flourish. And if you make mistakes, that's something I learned from I didn't learn much from Jim Sterling, but he had a very interesting system. He said, when you work, you do, he would choose a sketch. He did, or I did, and said, make 3 alternatives of that. And then of the best, you then choose the best of these 3 and do 3 alternatives. And you go on like that until you have an object which you are happy with. And it's this kind of process of yourself. You are the critic. The artist is the critic. It's not now you have modernist art is like people who are supposed to be artists, they create objects or occasions, and then they hand it to the critic of New York Times or the Le Monde, and the critics tell you whether this is great art or whether or not. Whereas the real artist, he is the critic, and he only hands out a product of his when he's happy with it, and when he can really defend it, and when he knows why it is good. So it is this strange separation of judgment, of criticism, and of producing, which is an absolute disaster today. And why people so depend, and they don't know what they're doing. And then when they get a good write-up in New York Times, they're happy. It may be nothing, it may be bullshit, And so I think the way to survive is not to reform the old system, because it's impossible. But you have first to know what you are good at, and then follow with other people who are good at what they are doing. And then you do, whether it's books or buildings or whatever you design, it's a product you can be proud of, and you know that people will like it. Otherwise, useless.
What would, in your opinion, be the best way to reform the architectural system? I mean, I've heard Andres Douani say at some point that reform it from the exterior will be too hard. What he hopes for is that somehow it gets reformed from the interior, that each institution or each college in its own way adapt its own architectural program. He talked about, I believe, an architectural program in Charleston, which actually, trains students in undergrad into all of those skills, and then they could go back and do an MArch program to be accredited architects. But I kind of wanted to hear your opinion on this. I've seen a couple of schools in Europe. One of them, I don't know if you know, La Table Ronde.
Yes, of course.
Yes. And others, I think, who started doing this. I kind of wanted you to expand on it.
Well, I think if I had any say, I would close all schools of architecture around the world. It wouldn't make any difference. I don't think it would make any difference to what is being built, because what is being built is so awful that it can't get worse. And because, I mean, I didn't study architecture. I studied for 2 terms, and then I worked for Sterling for 3 years. And then I was asked to teach at the AA before I was able to do a diploma. So I I trained myself while teaching, and that was interesting for 3-4 years. And then I gave up because I used the teaching to build my own theory, but was not my own. It was the theory of traditional architecture, how towns used to be made. And it was not perfect, but it worked. It became, I think, the basis of new urbanism in America. And there's some good, some bad, but it holds, because traditional architecture around the world was based on human scale, horizontally and vertically, and what human hands can build. So I think I would ask Elon Musk to look after architecture school. He would probably close them down, and just as well. And then, because what you learn mostly is actually by apprenticeship still. You start working for an office, and then when you are good at something in an office which is well run, you will finally do what you are good at. Because you will not be, if you are gifted in drawing, you will not be employed as an accountant, because it will be a waste of time. But the architects should be accountants rather than architects, because they have no clue about architecture. And it's because a diploma in architecture worldwide is virtually not worth the paper it's handed out on. And it forms a caste of self-interested or blind professionals who create the world, an ugly world. Imagine all buildings from, I always write this, but you probably heard of, imagine all buildings from before 45 disappeared, what the world would look like. It's just unthinkable, and how awful it would be. So I think you cannot save the world, but your duty as a creature of God, or whoever that is to save yourself and have fun in life, and really use your talents. And that is always love, what you love. That is, even the most unhappy people still know what they love. And that is what has to guide you. And if anyone tells you you must love this or that, which you don't love, that's a liar. He's a manipulator and a dogmatist, an unhappy person. And because it's really the love of objects that, thanks God, I grew up in a family who appreciated that. But when you are told the wrong thing, that you have to do this because it's your duty. No, I was in the army for 4 months, Luxembourg army, because I was conscripted. But I found out that physically and mentally, I was not able to be a good soldier, because you need to have a certain physique and also a certain mindset to be a good soldier. So I would lose, like we are now losing wars against the Russians, because we sent the wrong people on the front, and for the wrong reason. And so they have been lying to us now for 3 years that we are winning, that the Russians are incapable. No, the Russians have a strategy and thoughtful precision, and they are winning. So you have to get the right people in the right place, and you have to start with yourself, what you are good at, and then follow that, and then you will find. And publishing is very important, I think, because publishing creates a platform where that's something I learned with Sterling, is how to publish. That you do not publish anything you have produced. You may be very productive, you can produce thousands of beautiful drawings, but if you don't send the right thing to the web or to the newspapers, you don't get published. So it's very important to know how to publish. It's very important that by publishing, making things public, however, whether you stand on the street corner and publish, or you publish in newspapers or magazines or the web is fantastic means now. Through that, then you find the colleagues around locally or around the world you agree with and with whom you can create a compact, and I learned that from Sterling, and it really worked. So I was 8 years younger than my brother, and my brother was enormously productive, but he would send thousands of drawings around the world. They were never published. And from Sterling, I learned if you want to publish something, you have to produce 2 or 3 drawings, which are very striking, a very short text, and send them to magazines. That's what I did. And I was famous in like 6 months. I had published in all the major magazines. My brother was very surprised. How did you do that? So he learned from that. I taught him how to publish. And so because it's by publishing that you actually then create your own network and get the work you want. Because I was once struck by, I had an enormous project for Bremen, for the whole town of Bremen. And I asked the director of the Senate, why did you choose me? Why did you appoint me? And he said, well, you did this fantastic project for Echternach in Luxembourg. So I thought, if they commission you, I can commission you too. He had more power. But the project for Luxembourg, I had published everywhere, but was never commissioned. I commissioned it myself. So I think one of the jobs is to do new projects, but one of our jobs as artists and architects is also to correct the mistakes which have been built. It is an enormous field of development, how to correct towns with very little. You can actually, most beautiful places have been very badly now polluted by signage and horrible lampposts and trees being cut or planted where they shouldn't be and cut where they should stand. So correcting things is one very important. Then how to redevelop suburbs, for instance, like now in France, which are enormous projects, enormously demand enormous work to demolish 10-story high towers of buildings and rebuild a decent town. It's colossally difficult, but there are now people who know how to do it. The other one is to do new towns, which is much easier. But to do a new town, to be a real new town, not just new suburb, you need mixed use. You need some public institutions. So you need to find out what is you want to develop in. But it's certainly through publishing is very, very important. You start small and then maybe depend on your talent, whether you are a good strategist or better at designing objects. It's through publishing that you create network and you find, I never worked for money. I didn't have any inheritance, but I never had problems with money. Because if you have a talent immediately and you make it public, you get employed what you're good at. Like musicians, they get invited around the world because they play, 58 keys. And so it's very important to find out what you are good at, produce few projects which are really striking and spread them, and then you create your network. And certainly Notre Dame or the Table Ronde in Brussels, in Madrid, the Premio Manzano. Have you heard of that? It was not of the Driehaus. Driehaus created the Premio Manzano in Spain, and they now produce a yearbook, which is fantastic. Do you know it?
I haven't seen the yearbook, no.
I'll send you. I have PDF. Comes out the projects from Lebanon, from Tokyo, from Russia, from everywhere. So because we don't, if there is a good man in Russia, we talk to him. No, and not because he's Russian, we don't talk to him like the European community. The assholes, are in power now. I mean, not to talk to Kremlin for it's just criminal. We have to talk to each other, whether you agree ideologically or not. So this is very, that's the meaning of Catholic, means universal, that you are open to everything, if it's good. And then you have this kind of solidarity around the world of creating beautiful objects, which is, I think it's really, beauty unifies mankind. Because our humanity is expressed by what we not only are, but also by what we do. And to treat now like the Palestinians are being treated like animals. They are fantastic people, and they are being bombed to smithereens, and the disease, and I mean, how that is possible to then such a degradation now for 70 years, it's just unthinkable in our time, but it's happening now. So that threat is everywhere, and that therefore I think, if you are interested in music, the Daniel Barenboim and Edward Said. Edward Said was a Palestinian who taught at New York University. He's the author of book Orientalism. He
very well known, yeah.
And Daniel Barenboim was famous conductor, or is a famous conductor of Chicago Symphony, Berlin, and so on. They created the East-West on Divan Orchestra. And in order, that orchestra is composed of young people from Israel, Syria, Turkey, Jordan, Egypt, all the countries which are at war. And to start with, before they created first music schools in these countries, like 20 years ago, to train young people to, in 10 years, when they are masters, to form the new orchestra of East-West on Divan Orchestra. They interviewed the young people who came to their schools in the different countries. What do you think, in Syrian, they would ask him, what do you think of Israelis? And they would say, they are animals. And the Israelis, they asked, what do you think of Jordanians? They are animals. And the Egyptians, they asked, what do you think of these? And they all thought they were animals. They were trained in music. Now they play in the same orchestra and they marry. And it's fantastic. The world is now one of the famous orchestras of the world. So I was once invited to Israel, and I said, yes, I come if I can do for planning and architecture what Daniel Barenboim and Edward Said did for music. The guy said, I have to ask my minister. And then they never called back, because we need a strategic. No, if you just go on killing Palestinians, you're not going to solve the problem. And so we need a solution for that geography, which is going to hold. And that must be both human and geometric. We need a plan for what is going to happen to this geography. Otherwise, we will end up in the Third World War. And very few people seem to, who are now at the top, seem to understand that we need a solution in order to work towards it. Otherwise, what is the solution to kill Palestinians is not a project. And it's going to haunt the Jewish people, not only the Zionists, but the Jewish people for centuries. No. And that's why you have now in New York people who say, not in our name, for Jews who disagree with the Zionists. And there is that we need some common project which allows these country of people who are now so brought up against each other because of, for reasons, for tragic past, 70 years of horrible violence. So there needs a project to, and I think, Mikko Pellet. Have you heard of Mikko Pellet?
Mikko Pellet.
He wrote.
I'm not sure.
He was brought up as Zionist, but then became supporter of Palestinian cause. He now has the Palestinian office on Penn Avenue in Mikko Pellet, The General Sun. It's a fantastic book. Very important. That he says the two-state solution for Palestine won't work because people, they are so worked. They need one state where everyone is equal. I mean, so evident that you wonder why it takes so much time, but he's good. And we need that also in architecture, because in order to build a country, you need an urban and architectural concept. There was, I was involved in this project in Guatemala, and we were told, we met somebody who grows coffee in a big way. And he gave a lecture to us, and he said, to do good coffee, you need to respect climate, altitude, and soil. That clicked with me. That's exactly what you need for good architecture. Climate, soil, and altitude. And so those three factors, which are our conditions around the world. And that is also what's interesting, why the different vernaculars around the world. They're often very similar depending on the soil or the altitude. Like in Tibet, in the Himalayas, you have an architecture which is very similar. The vernacular is very similar to the architecture of the Nevada, Sierra Nevada in Spain, next to Granada. You go up Sierra Nevada. Very similar. Same flat roof, same technique of insulating the roof, and even same similar expression. Or the architecture of the Basque country and the hilly Basque country, and the architecture of Switzerland, of the mountains in Switzerland, is often very similar. And so there is this kind of constants which need to be respected. The problem with modernism was that they could, with one single Esperanto, architecture Esperanto, they could, and machinery, they could have the same building type and materials in the Sahara or in Siberia. And it's against all common sense. Because so climate, and therefore this whole climate change nonsense, and just as well scrap it, because traditional architecture and traditional urbanism are respectful of these elements, otherwise they don't function. You have to stop me or guide me, because otherwise I'll go.
Yeah, I think we're going to go for our last question. I kind of wanted to jump on an anecdote. I don't know if you've seen it, but a couple of days ago, there were a lot of reports that came, or news, I would say, there's still not reports that came out about structures that were actually under the Giza pyramid. They're talking about kilometers of underground structure that they believe actually spare 50 kilometers into the ground, and then made them think that actually, you know what, perhaps Giza is not a tomb, but actually was used by the Egyptian civilization to actually either produce energy or for other advanced technological purposes. And so it brought up the entire whole debate of, whether these ancient civilizations were were perhaps much more advanced than we think they actually were. And this sort of reminded me of the beautiful drawings you did of Atlantis. And I kind of really wanted to ask whether when you did those drawings of Atlantis, you had these ideas in mind, or it was purely out of speculation.
I haven't looked at this latest thing about Giza, but it is strange that we want to see in old civilizations what we are, and think that maybe they were as advanced. Well, they were human civilizations, and they were good at what they were doing. So, and we are not advanced. We are just different. I mean, if you think on the human side, to be able to produce some disasters like we produce now, we are not advanced. Morally, we are really in the sinister period. which could end up with the World War. But what the man who is most interesting about to read about Egypt is Velikovsky. Have you read?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Earth in Upheaval and Moses and Akhenaton.
Yeah.
And he says his basic. It used to be bestsellers. Huh? I don't know whether they are still selling, but it's fantastically interesting. I read like for 3 months all his books. And the message is really that the pyramids are structures which were a response to enormous cataclysmic events. They were the only form which could resist extremely violent events of earth, of climate and telluric upheavals, because it's almost indestructible, the pyramid. And it's very interesting because he says his main theory is that the biblical recounts we have, or mythology of ancient gods and the violence which is displayed there, is that when things are so violent, when events are so violent, that the human memory refuses to recall them as such because they are so painful that you transform them into mythological legends, which makes them bearable. They reflect what happened, but they are in different form, and otherwise just pain. And you give them poetical or kind of ritual form, not to forget, like memory. No, they are there, but they are not just sheer violence. And I think it's worth reading Velikovsky. Whether they were technological or whether we come from another planet, who knows? Huh? We know very little about it, and unless we have any proof of it, it's all a lot of speculation. El Wakil also knows a lot about these things.
And how about Atlantis?
No, Atlantis was, yeah, it was a strange project because it was commissioned by a German couple they are modern art collectors, and they have the biggest German art collection of modern art. They are both dead now, unfortunately, and but they had also some idea about the future, ecology, and so on. And they wanted to create a place where I thought it was too utopian at the time. I did it because I was in depression. My post-Speer depression I forced myself every day on the table to do this project. And I said, what a horrible thing to have to do a project when you don't enjoy it. And it was the only period of my life where I didn't enjoy doing the work. I still did, but still. But the idea was to create a place in the world where elites of politics, economy, science, humanities, crafts, sports would be invited. Really, the best people around the world would be invited to have a residency for several months. And the model was the French or the American Academy in Rome. Where there are people who got the Rome Prize, they're invited, they're free of, they have a big atelier and they can live there for 2 years and do whatever they think is, because they are so good that you can, and adult, that you can leave them, give them that freedom to do what they are good at. And I thought it was too utopian. And anyway, I didn't understand why they wanted me to do this project. Their art collection, I thought was just, well, forget about it. And so, but I think there was a deeper reason to do that. And I think it is really missing such a place where people, imagine a place where you could invite, instead of Davos, because Davos in a way is that, but it has kind of political bias, and it excludes people who don't agree with its political bias. where world leaders, you know, the Putin or I don't know, all the who was the Canadian guy, you know, who was just lost his job. You know, these people, they were trained in Davos. Not trained, but they were leaders according to the Davos, Mr. Klaus Schwab, you know, you heard of him.
Yeah.
He's like Dr. Strangelove, the Kubrick movie. And so they form elite around the world who have kind of similar project, but it is not a cultural project. It's an economic project, and Putin is actually more interesting than he's officially supposed. He's supposed to be an evil, the impersonation of evil, but he has an interesting project which should be respected. Not that I care for, but one has to know. But to have a place in the world where these people would meet and can talk and exchange ideas, to get a notion where is humankind developing, or what would be, you know, if all our societies are based, all our economies are based on the idea of growth. But if you grow, you have to know what you want to grow into. What is the adult form of the object you are growing into? And it may well be a monster. So how to avoid that? So you need to have an idea of the future of what is change for what, because change by itself may develop into some horrible monstrosity and end of time. And there are, of course, today these people who, you know, the Armageddon and the crazy Zionists and Christian Zionists, I mean, whatever they want. For me, it's like a madness. Huh? But to have a place intellectually where really philosophers and economists and musicians, people who are really interested and have free time to think, that they are not driven by some urgency, where the basic political orientation of different parties, whether left or right or center, should go. And then they compete for a goal rather than just competing for the next, to win the next election with whatever lies they produce. And unfortunately, that was not it was actually, the project was, I never had an object which was so much exhibited. We had exhibitions around Europe, with every exhibition had a catalog and was with the lush models and paintings and so on. And the Müllers who were the initiators behind, they actually talked to presidents and chancellors. And we finally had the head of the German bank got interested. And he wanted to fund the first phase of the project, but he was killed for other reasons. He was an extraordinary guy. And he probably wanted to reform the banking system in a way. I don't know enough about it. I only heard recently. But it was, I think, actually, it was an important thing, because the French Academy, you know, in Rome, you heard of the Villa Medici in Rome, where for 200 years was created, I think, under Napoleon, and where the best people of the Beaux-Arts, you know, those who get the Rome Prize, are sent to Rome and have to do then a project in Rome. And these incredible reconstructions of Pompeii, of Pergamon, whatever, you know, from the archaeology, we now know the reconstructions of Rome or Greek or Roman ensembles was done by these people in those periods, because in a free time where they could do these incredible projects. Huh? And there were these big exhibitions, Pompeii, Rome, and Athens, where you saw the original work of these artists and archaeologists, where you had a wall full of an elevation of a town, where every square inch was unbelievably carefully done and beautifully rendered. Huh? And that created an elite of architects who in America created the City Beautiful movement, or the famous landscaping in America, and which led to these fantastic cemeteries. I mean, the cemeteries in America are something, you know, to celebrate. It's very strange why American cemeteries are so much superior. I try to reform European cemeteries. It's impossible. I always insisted that in each project I do, we have a cemetery because we're all going to die, and we want to die in a nice place, to rest in a nice place. And it's impossible. The mafias who control this, so that the cemeteries look like parking spaces. You don't want to be buried anymore. That's why people get cremated, because the cemeteries are so awful. But anyway, you know, to have a notion of what our environment should be like if we go on doing what we are doing now, what will it be like? And that is when I started to talk to Sterling about this. What is your overall vision? And he had no clue. He was the most famous with Kahn. He was the most famous architect in 1970 when I worked, 60, 68, when I worked for him. He had no clue what it was the overall product. So it's very important that you as an architect know in what part of the overall environmental picture you work to, because it's only by contributing to a meaningful and beautiful thing that you will have pleasure yourself. Otherwise, it's a waste of time and money and earning. Huh?
All right, Leon, thank you very much for conducting this interview. I mean, I could
2
go on
hours.
and on and on, but I think it covered a lot of things that perhaps you haven't had a chance to expand on in previous interviews. So I will let you know whenever I can.
Where are all the people coming from?
I think mainly from Beirut. We have some from New York as well.
Yasmina, I know Yasmina, who worked in Qatar. No, she's not her, probably.
And then, and you know, this actually, that's why when I reached out to you the first time, my big idea was to host an architectural debate, because I think that, you know, since I've been here and attending this program at GSAP, we hasn't had architectural debates. I'm like, what happened with architectural debates? Why aren't you having our architectural debates? I spend the whole day trying to listen to, you know, people who debate about history and archaeology and science and every matter, but in architecture, there's no debate anymore. So it's like, let me try to host a debate. So I had this idea of hosting a debate with you and Perrault to kind of open my first thing. Remember, I sent you an email. I got an answer from you afterwards, and you told me,
When?
absolutely, I will actually do it next week. I'm talking about maybe 5 or 6 months ago.
It's interesting because with Maurice Culot, we have been trying to have debates with modernists now for 30 years. And it's a long story, another 10 minutes, because somebody in Pamplona, in Madrid, from Madrid, had organized a debate between Perrault, the mayor of Paris, Hidalgo, and myself in Pamplona. They accepted, but the day before they canceled. I told the guy, no, Fernandez Galliano, they will refuse. No, they accept, they are looking for, the day before they canceled. And that had happened to me 20 years before in France. Finkielkraut, who was a friend, a philosopher, famous philosopher.
Alain Finkielkraut, yes.
Alain Finkielkraut. Roger Scruton told me, you should contact Finkielkraut. And I wrote to him 3 times, never answered. So I said, no, this is the 3rd time I write to you. You should make debates about architecture. It's important, even for philosophy. So finally, the 3rd time he answered, and he said, who would you want to debate on France Culture? I said, Jean Nouvel. Jean Nouvel was a friend in the 70s. Jean Nouvel did the first big job I got in France was because of Jean Nouvel and his wife for a big school in Saint-Quentin en Yvelines. And actually, when the architect who was supposed to build my school, he tried to steal the job, he was fired, and Jean Nouvel did my first permit for that school. So we were very close. When he came to London, he stayed with me, and when I went to Paris, I stayed with them. And so this was now 20 years later. He has now become Jean Nouvel, you know. Before he was not known. And we had this debate with Finkelkraut, and was clearly he was not used to debate dialectically. He is used to preach. And so after this was called Réplique on France Culture. So after this, which I don't know how many thousand people listen to this, I was then invited to have big debates in the Auditorium du Louvre or in CCI in the Beaubourg and so on. And I had three people, Porzampar, Nouvel, and the other guy who did the Ministry of Finance, I forget his name, Chemetov, incredibly pompous guy, but I like to have sort of confrontations. They accepted, and exactly like with Hidalgo, and the day before they refused.
But I think you did a debate with Peter Eisenman, no?
But always in America.
Always in America, yeah.
And so, always under the protection of either the Bob Stern or people like that who protected us both. Or Philip
but Johnson. I thought it was extremely interesting. I mean, I've heard and heard again, and that's what got me inspired. I'm like, why don't we see more of this? And of course, not just with you, but there are many people, even within the modern movement, who don't agree with.
Well, here a proposal maybe coming from you, it would be to make a debate between Pritzker and Driehaus prizes.
That would be.
We have been proposing this for years now. Michael Likoudis has proposed it, you know, the old dean of Notre Dame. And the lady who is the head of, I forget her name, of the Pritzker, she's very sympathetic. She wants to do this, but I had debate. I worked for Rothschild for a while in London. And on a Sunday morning, we had breakfast together with Foster, with Norman Foster. And Foster looked at me like he was a bit tense. So I looked at him after we had eaten our breakfast. I said, look, the way you look at me is very strange. But you know, I know that you respect what I do because I respect what you do. They're very different. But you do well what you do, and I do well what I do. But we represent two very different conceptions of architecture in modern society. And we should have public debate. And he was sort of, I said on the BBC, because I was a lot on BBC at the time. I knew people who could have done that. And he was sort of very uncomfortable. We had debates at the AA with Rogers, which were always friendly, or at Papadakis had these debates, but they were not public. So then, now many years later, like more than 10 years later, 20 years later, I was at the Biennale in Venice, invited by Hollein. And I had just complimented the French modernist, Michel Kagan, you know, Kagan.
Yes.
He's the best French modernist. He died, unfortunately, very young. He worked for Richard Meyer, but what he did is really like the best of Corbusier, Purism, and so on. So I just complimented him, and he was like, his wife was very reluctant that I should compliment her husband. But he was really interesting. And then came a woman and she said, hello, Leon, how are you? And I recognized her from, I had met her long before. She was Helena Ochoa, who had been in Spain. She was she had an important sex chat on Spanish television. And I remembered her, I had met her before. And I said, of course, hello, Helena, how are you? And she stepped aside, and there was Norman Foster. Can I present my new husband? I said, Norman, wow. So Helena is the person who can do our public debate. Because she was a famous television personality. And so she would have been ideal to make a public debate, but he froze like literally. But maybe by now it would be time. But
I think I don't see it anymore. I've been in New York for a year now, where usually, I would have expected to see a lot of it, and unfortunately, I don't. Architectural debates and lectures became incredibly boring. Incredibly boring. But anyways, Leon, thank you very much for your time, and I will send you an email once I do all the editings and I publish it on YouTube. And hope we can have a conversation like this again, hopefully in the form of a debate this time. I'll do my best to try to get one of them, and hopefully I become successful. But thank you very much. It was very insightful.
You could organize debate between Putin and Trump on architecture. That could be.
If I'm able to reach out, of course, I think that would be interesting.
Good. Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Good luck. Good luck. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.